and welcome to our first lecture in Teaching Speaking. The topic of today's lecture is the nature of spoken language. And this class is a companion class with the Teaching Listening and Teaching English Pronunciation. And I might even say there are some elements in this course that are going to overlap a little bit with classroom English as well. Today's lesson, we're going to talk about the nature of spoken language and contrast it with written language. So maybe compare, contrast. See, we don't usually think of written language and spoken language as being that much different, and yet they are. They're quite a bit different. Today's lesson will also outline what should be studied in a speaking course like the one that we're doing right now. So this is it a question? Knowing about or knowing how? Have you ever thought about that? Knowing about something or knowing how to do something, okay? There is a difference between knowing the rules and being able to deploy them, to follow those rules. Deploy means to, not just to follow, but to engage in, to interact in terms of following the rules. Sometimes we know the rules, but we choose not to follow the rules. So there is a difference, right, between knowing about and knowing how. This course will look at both knowing about speaking English as well as how to teach the speaking of English. We'll start with knowing about speaking in general. So generally speaking, what does it mean to speak? We're gonna hear the word speak a lot, generally speaking, okay? So what is speaking? I'm doing it right now. It's something that you do, most of us do every day. And then sometimes if we have a day alone and we don't speak all day, and then the next day we meet some people and it's kind of hard to get our words out after not speaking for a day. Speaking is one of the 4 skills that are taught in a language program, right? So reading, writing, speaking, listening. Do you teach a class that is only speaking? Maybe, but probably not. It's going to be combined with something else. Usually speaking and listening are combined together, but not necessarily. Speaking is a productive skill. It is an oral skill, meaning it's oral means it's spoken. It is productive, meaning that we are creating it. Speaking is it consists of utterances, of sounds, words, and sentences. So think about how a child develops. First, they spend the first few years mostly just listening, but they're making sounds, and pretty soon those sounds start to turn into words, and then eventually words turn into sentences, and then our discourse grows from there. Speaking as we are speaking is moving forward. It's constantly moving forward. And then once something is said, it cannot really be unsaid as long as there's a listener who heard it. Speaking barely resembles the language that we study in writing. And this is sort of a theme, I guess, that we're going to talk about, especially today and in our next lesson. But spoken language and written language are really different from each other. So what is speaking? Again, with that question, what is speaking? Speaking is not a discrete skill. It's not something that is by itself, okay? Speaking is grammar. Grammar is part of speaking. Speaking is grammar. Speaking is listening. Because unless we are, well, I was going to say, unless we are talking to ourselves, but even talking to ourselves, we're listening to ourselves as we're speaking. And so if we cannot hear ourselves speak, it becomes really hard to speak. Not impossible, but very difficult to speak without listening. Speaking is pronunciation. Because if you don't pronounce the words and the sounds properly, the listener cannot understand what you're saying. Speaking is understanding the culture and the setting. If you don't understand anything about the culture, the words are going to come out wrong, okay? And if you don't take into consideration the setting in which you are speaking, you are going to make mistakes. So speaking is understanding the culture, it is understanding the setting, It is a reflection of the setting where we are speaking. Speaking is checking understanding constantly. Okay? Speaking is thinking. And this one here that's in pink at the bottom, pink and italics, so it must be important, right? Speaking, it is a medium for teaching and learning other things. A medium, which means sort of a way of doing things, right? So a medium for teaching and learning other things. This is a different color, so you can guess that we're probably going to come back to this. So don't forget about this, because we're going to come back to this and talk about it quite a bit. More about this, what is speaking? Speaking, well, what are some features of speaking? Speaking is composed of idea units. So it's not just sounds. Those sounds represent meaning, and we put them together into units. So it's joined together, phrases and clauses, not just words. It might be planned, but usually speaking is unplanned. Okay, now what I'm doing right now is a planned speech, right? I have planned it out in advance. I even made a PPT. What we do in our classroom is probably 50% planned and 50% spontaneous, because we know what we're going to say. We have an outline of our lecture, of our lesson, but every single thing that comes out of our mouth is not planned. So generally speaking, when we are talking, it is unplanned. It is, speaking has more vague or generic general words than written language does. There's written language needs to be very clear and precise, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. Speaking has fixed phrases, meaning things that we say over and over again, things that are pretty regular in our speech that if it was writing, we wouldn't put them there, okay? Speaking has fillers, things that fill the silence, things that come out of our mouth, right? Right? The things that we say to fill the silence as we're thinking. Maybe hesitation marks. Hesitation markers, meaning, as I'm doing it right now, maybe we are thinking of something to say. So as we're thinking, some sounds are coming out. Also, hesitation markers, meaning we might not want to say the next thing. And so we're hesitant to say something, but we need to say it. So we're going to spread things out a little bit. We'll pause. So it has these characteristics. Speaking, as I'm talking about speaking, I'm very aware of these things. Speaking contains slips and errors reflecting ongoing mental processing, okay? So something that you'll hear with native English speakers that you might actually hear surprisingly more than you would expect is how often grammar mistakes are being made. And that's because as they're coming out of our mouth, things change, right? And sometimes our mental processing and our words that are coming out are not in sync. So sometimes we make a few grammar mistakes that we would never make in writing, but just as they're coming out, maybe a tense error or a subject-verb agreement slips in because our thinking or thought process and our speaking, they get out of sync with each other, and our mouths keep going and we don't even realize what we're saying. And that's a characteristic of spoken language that's not really in written language. It involves reciprocity, meaning it's a transactional, it's interactional as well. So unless I am standing in a room by myself talking to nothing, there's not even a mirror to be talking to, there is some sort of reciprocity, some sort of exchange going on, okay? Now, as I'm thinking about this, the last slide, this slide, and the next slide, I can't help but think about, what about text messaging? Because text messaging has a lot of these characteristics, what we do on our KakaoTalk or SMS. Text messaging is generally more like spoken language than it is written language. It has a lot of the characteristics of spoken language. It's not really part of our lesson, but I think it's kind of interesting. I think it's a fascinating thing to think about it. At least it is for me. So if we are studying language and we're studying speaking, these are the categories, I guess. The three ovals show the three main parts of a spoken language. So spoken language, I'll start at the bottom and go up. Spoken language has sound, the kind of the most basic part of a spoken language. But spoken language also has structure to it. It's not just sound. Okay, there is structure to it. Spoken language has organization and behavior as well. And so if we are studying these like academically, or if we are teaching them, these are the words and phrases that might get used to talk about these things. So again, starting at the bottom and going up, the sound, we in another course I talk a lot about phonetics and phonemics, and that's the study of the sound itself, and kind of prosody or intonation studies. Okay, like the suprasegmentals is something I mentioned in the pronunciation class. That's also called prosody. Once we get into studying the structure, that's for some people, it's the most interesting thing. For other people, it's the least interesting thing. And that's where we're studying grammar, right? We're studying the syntax, and we're studying morphology and vocabulary studies and phonology, kind of I would almost say it's where we take the language and turn it into a science, is we're really looking at these sorts of things, and maybe a little bit here as well. So the structure is the grammar, right? But then we have the organization. There's a little bit of overlap there. Organization and behavior, the psycholinguistics and sociolinguistics. So we're starting to take the language itself and then figure out how it fits in with other things. Pragmatics. This is one that's always hard for me to say. Okay, it's a speaking class. So if I were teaching children who struggle with the word, I would say sound it out. Sound out the word. I always stumble when I'm saying this word. Kinesics, okay? It's a study of movement, okay? And then discourse and conversational analysis. Discourse is sort of studying how the language is used, okay? How we might speak differently in one particular socio group than another. So discourse analysis and maybe the power that is inherent in a language. For example, the way we speak differently to a teacher versus another student, or a student versus another teacher. So that's discourse analysis, conversational analysis. So these expressions come up when you're studying language, okay? When we're studying speaking. Speaking is complex. Speaking is complicated, and it is different from writing. Okay, even though it's something that we do every single day, it is complex. We don't really think about it, but it's complex. If we have nerve damage, like a brain injury, we lose our speaking before we lose other aspects of language, right? We can still hear and understand, but we might not be able to speak. It is much more complex than other areas of language. Now, comparing spoken language and written language. I've sort of been hinting at this all along, how different they are from each other. Many of us teachers, we don't really acknowledge we don't even realize how different spoken language and written language are. But sometimes something happens and we know that it's wrong. And I'll give an example, kind of going the other direction. When you see a student writing something on their papers that is really common in spoken language, when it's written down, we say, oh, that doesn't look right. Like gonna, like I'm gonna go. That's the way we speak. I'm gonna go home today. I'm gonna go home after this class. I'm gonna, but we don't do that in writing, right? So when we're speaking, we blend things together. The grammar actually changes a little bit. It's so different than what's written down. And we tend, when we're teaching speaking, we tend to really be teaching writing, but just we're doing it orally. And we don't realize we're doing that, and that could be a bit of a problem for our learners. We need to be aware of some of the main differences and features between spoken and written language. Okay, we don't want to just teach the written language, but out loud. Okay, obviously they're related to each other. Spoken language and written language are related. They are language, and when we're studying English, they are both parts of English language, or if we're studying Korean, both parts of Korean language. You can't have one really without the other, although I guess we could have language without the written language, right? But it's hard to have a written language without a spoken language, although we see that with Latin. If we say it's a dead language, it's not spoken anymore, but it's still studied as a written language. So it's kind of weird. Although they're related, they typically serve different social purposes and have different audiences, right? Speakers and writers draw on common linguistic resources, but they utilize them in very different ways. How? Okay, the spoken discourse, written discourse, they do have some things in common. Okay, they have a lot in common, but written language is static. Once it's written and once it's published, it does not change. It is planned. It is visual. It is non-transient, meaning it doesn't move. Really, it's decontextualized. I'm doing some of the things that I'm talking about with spoken language. It's decontextualized, meaning let's say I write an article and it gets published. I can show that article to other teachers and they would understand it. I show that article to engineers and they would look at it and think, oh, that's interesting, right? Or I show that article to native German speakers whose English is pretty good but not great. They're going to read that very differently. Okay, there is a context for written language. There is a context for spoken language that when it's written, it can be moved around and be decontextualized. Okay, spoken language, it is unplanned. Okay, it sounds like what I'm saying right now seems much more unplanned than it really is, but it is transient and it is dynamic. Okay, meaning it moves around with us and it's constantly changing. One of the things about it being dynamic also is that spoken language changes over time much more quickly than written language does. And by that I mean the language that's used by kids these days, the younger generation, sounds very different than the language that my grandparents used, although the written language is still pretty similar, right? So in that way, it's dynamic, it's changing, but also it is developing. It develops and morphs and becomes something else much more quickly than written language does. And as I stumbled with a moment ago, it is context dependent. Okay, written is decontextualized. Spoken language is very context dependent. Okay, so comparing these two, written discourse is done in advance, right? It is when we're writing something, before we hit, if it's an email or something digital, before we hit send or before we put the document into an envelope and send it in the post office or deliver it to somebody, before we actually give it to somebody else, we have the option to plan it and rewrite it and make changes before it's given, right? So we can think and we can plan out the text in advance. Usually written language is in a logical kind of linear order. Although if you teach writing, you might realize that not everybody is logical and detailed as other people are, but generally speaking, written has a logic that isn't there in spoken language. We're able to write and edit and make changes before we deliver the message. We do not know the reader's response. Okay, we can predict and we can guess and we can hope, but we don't know how the reader is going to respond. And written language is always more formal than spoken language. Okay. Now, on the other side, spoken language does not usually plan in advance unless it's giving a speech, giving a lecture. But generally, it is not planned in advance. And when we're talking, it's always moving forward. Now we can go back and say, I said 5 minutes ago, I said blah, 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 but we have to go back and say it again, okay? I might say, remember what I told you yesterday, and then move forward, but there has to be some sort of cue for that to happen. And we could think about things on our own, but while we're thinking about what was said yesterday, we're missing what's being said right now. So it's constantly moving forward. And as I'm speaking, as I'm talking to somebody face to face, I see a response immediately in the person's body language, in their facial expressions. I know immediately, if I'm paying attention, I know that they understood me. I know that they're angry at what I just said or happy at what I just said. Their body language tells me that they heard me, that they understood me, and then they will respond in some way, whether positive, neutral, or negative, or threatening, or some sort of emotion, right? So we can see that response immediately, okay, if we can see them. Okay, now we're talking on the phone. Maybe we don't see the response, but we can hear a response. Talking on the phone is a very different experience than talking face to face. When we're talking, a lot of times we think out loud, right? As we're thinking through a process, words are coming out, the other person's listening, and that means that because we're thinking out loud, our words and our thoughts are disorganized, okay? We make utterances and pauses, and we speak out of order. Utterances, we'll talk about this in a minute a little bit more, like, right? We make little noises and we pause, we stop. And it's hard to pause in writing. And of course, the opposite of the other, it is less formal. So I want to look at a transcript of an interview. And this is a famous actress, okay? Emma Watson. She was famous for playing Hermione Granger in the Harry Potter series, and that was her as a child. Now she's grown up, and she's playing Belle in Beauty and the Beast, and she's talking about that experience in an interview. Now, when it is written, it doesn't really look that much like spoken language. Now, when we read this, I'm going to read it out loud. I have two different color texts. But also, we have to remember that when actors are promoting a movie or a film or promoting something, they're going to interview, and they're going to another interview, they're going to another interview. And a lot of what they say is scripted, meaning it's prepared in advance. So it's a lot more like written. However, not everything is. And we'll see the difference quite a bit here when we look at this. So this is what we're doing right now, is kind of discourse analysis, right? We're looking at something that's words. In this case, they were spoken, and we're analyzing those. So this is an example of some discourse analysis. So the pink is very much her thinking out loud, and it's not as organized as what's otherwise written. Okay, so I'll read it out loud. Yeah, no, I mean, I think I feel blessed to have already played one of my childhood heroes, which was Hermione. And then to get to play another one, I feel like that's almost unique to an actress to get to do that. So I was like, wow, this is I just feel incredibly lucky to have the career that I'm having. So this is from her interview, and so it's a little bit out of order. She repeats herself, and these pauses in the real interview were a little bit louder. At the end of the last slide, I actually have a link if you want to actually watch this interview. Yeah, no, that's something that I hear a lot. When somebody's responding, they start with yeah, no. The yeah is the acknowledgement that I heard you, but then no is the actual response. But then she clarifies, no, I mean, I think I feel blessed because, it is, when we look at it, it looks really quite weird. Now, the big chunk of black here, that's the exact same thing that she says in many interviews. So that is very much like planned written speech, but because it is planned in advance. But then when she's thinking out loud here, and it gets a little bit awkward. And that's a characteristic of speech. And it's something that when we are listening, when we are interacting with that, we don't even hear most of that. But when we see it, when it's taken and written down on the page, then it becomes very clear that, ooh, this looks a lot different than what I remember. Because when we're listening, we filter out a lot of this sort of, these filler words and this sort of thing. Now, I said, remember that little pink line at the bottom. We're going to come back to that. And that's what we're doing here. Okay. It's important to ask yourself, as an English teacher, are you engaged in teaching the speaking form of a language, or are you teaching a language through speaking? What does that mean? Are you teaching the speaking form of a language? When we're teaching speaking, are we actually teaching speaking, or are we teaching English, but we're doing it by speaking? I don't know. What is it that you're doing? Maybe a little bit of both? Most of us, I think, are probably doing this. What's in pink. Most of us don't teach the speaking skills. We teach the language, but we do so through speaking. And there can be quite a difference. I would guess that very few of you, or maybe even none of you, but maybe there are a few who do, don't actually teach a speaking class where we concentrate on just the different aspects of speaking. What we are, let me clarify here, the aspects of speaking, the discourse levels, the structural levels, the level of speech production. We don't teach this, okay? And I suggest that you probably shouldn't really, especially if we're teaching elementary school kids. This is kind of the science of it. And maybe if you're teaching in a university course, perhaps you might do that. Teaching a linguistics class or teaching how to teach English, then you might get into this. But most of us, when we are teaching our learners, we don't do that so much. Most of us teach a language through speaking, okay? And it's difficult to separate speaking from other objectives, right? How do we teach phonics without, phonics is part of speaking, right? And it's part of what we do with our beginners and this phonics is sounds plus spelling, but phonics is part of language. So we're also teaching spelling and we're teaching the sounds that go along with it, teaching pronunciation and fluency. That's part of what we're teaching in a speaking class, but we're also teaching pronunciation when we're teaching phonics. And it's hard to separate these different components. Usually, we're going to see teaching, speaking, and listening together. Studying, speaking, and listening together. Teaching idioms. Maybe you have a class on idioms. Maybe you like to teach idioms as a fun way to introduce a class. But these are things that we teach, but we teach them through speaking. So what is this course? This course will focus on a variety of skills that fall under that umbrella of speaking, okay? There'll be some theoretical side of things and there'll be some practical as well, a little bit of both. What this course isn't, okay, I'm not gonna focus so much on pronunciation. Maybe here and there a little bit, but generally no, because there is another whole course on pronunciation. This isn't a course that is going to focus on listening because there is another course that focuses on listening. We're not going to do a whole lot of classroom English because there is a course that focuses on classroom English. However, all of these things overlap with each other. So there's going to be some things that I say in this course that I also say in the other courses, okay? So that's it for today's lesson. And every lesson I end with this closing slide. That's all for today. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. But also, I hope today's lesson, I hope it gave you something to think about and think about as you are teaching your own classes, okay? Maybe you're thinking, am I teaching the same as spoken language, the same as written language? Am I doing it differently? I pulled some information from these sources. Most of my slides will have a reference at the end. If you are interested, you can pause and stop there. I'm not going to read them out every time, okay? Usually I'll pass over them pretty quickly, although I did say that, there's the YouTube video clip of Emma Watson. And that's all for our first lesson in teaching speaking. Take care, and I'll see you in our next one.